So my name is Emily Holland, and I'm the editor of Poet Lore, America's oldest poetry magazine, which we publish in print twice a year here at the Writers Center. I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writers Center Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little bit less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. And please welcome tonight's guest, Shayla Seabree. So excited to have Shayla here, a fellow AU alum and also a former Poet Lore editorial assistant. So we're really kind of making some connections here. Shayla, if you would like to start by introducing yourself, maybe telling us a little bit about who you are and your new book, Field Study, and then read just a few pages for us to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you everyone at the Writers Center for having me. It feels like a homecoming of sorts to do something in DC, even though I'm coming to you all from my attic in central Pennsylvania. I am an assistant professor and the director of the Stadler Center for Poetry and Literary Arts at Bucknell University. I've been here for 2 years. I've moved around the Mid-Atlantic a lot. My first book, Mistress, came out in 2019, and then the second book, Field Study, came out just a few days ago, in fact, or a week ago. And so Field Study is looking at desire and Black womanhood, but it attempts to do so through an anthropological field study that sort of unravels, and the clinicality that I'm sort of striving for in the beginning and the investigative nature of it sort of unravels as we get deeper and deeper into the story. And so yeah, I'll read just a little bit for you all, and then I'm happy to answer questions. I'm excited to be in conversation. Thank you all for being here this evening. And I'll start somewhere. It's a book-length prose poem written in sections, or maybe a book of prose poems, or maybe it's something entirely different. And I think that flexibility is something I'm continuing to grapple with the project in terms of talking about it. It's sort of like a moving puzzle piece, but if you can see it, it comes in these like tiny blurbs across the page for those of you who might not have seen the interior yet. And I'll just read, like Emily said, a couple of pages. So this is somewhere near the middle. Field Study. In the Disney version, Pocahontas sings about how it's impossible to return to the exact same place, how nothing remains the same. In reality, she didn't fall for Smith. She went with Rolfe, converted to Christianity, became Rebecca, wife of Isaac, the unsacrificed. Quote, "You cannot step twice into the same stream. All entities move and nothing remains still." Heraclitus. Still, I want the water of our first bath together, baptismal font in which I hope to be reborn into someone who felt worthy of love. I met you 2 months after he told me he no longer wanted to be with me. In Disney, Pocahontas quotes philosophy. In reality, Rolfe touted her as a civilized savage. She died a year later. For me, all the men who came closest to savagery were civilized men in a universal sense. When the field was a field, where would I have been in it? In colonial Williamsburg, in front of a 4-poster bed, a white woman asked me, "Do you wonder what it would have been like to sleep in it?" I never wanted to write about slavery or its legacy, but I cannot seem to escape the intergenerational reality. Maybe one day I'll feel Morfell Rath Hines free, writing radiant on linen, loosed from this particular type of examination. I rewatch Mad Men in winter to try to recreate a river. Replay The Night We Met and the entirety of the White Lighter album ad nauseum. I like knowing where I'm going. Maybe that's why I keep writing the same poem about how I fear the dawn, that blue hue hour before sun we filled with talk of babies that would never come. After the 2016 election, Total Praise and You Are the Living Word were added to rotation. Note, why am I writing this? Note, why do I write anything? Lord Huron talks about love like a haunting. Routine makes it easier to breathe when I want for the ache of ambering leaves. I am relieved when the clock undulates at 4:44, the time at which my mother was born. After you left, I stated proudly that you weren't the best thing that happened to me. But still you I found myself chasing. This a learned behavior. Defense mechanism for not wanting to admit I felt the trace paper thin of leaf decomposition. Typhoon's postscript made a mantra of not loving unconditionally. You said you did, that I didn't afford you the same courtesy. We both constructed narratives in which I was not worthy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like I could have sat and listened to you read for so much longer. But that's just the way that these kind of prose chunks flow together so well.
Yeah.
And Zach has reminded me in the chat, please, please, please order a copy of Field Study. We recommend going to your local independent bookseller, buying directly from the publisher, or using the bookshop link provided there. Please get a copy if you don't have one already. It's so fabulous. So I think, you know, the passage that you read gave me a lot of different threads where I could start the conversation, but maybe I'll start where I started in the document I sent you, just not to not to throw you off.
No problem.
But you know, structurally, like you said, it is kind of this extended prose poem or maybe a sequence of things, but there are so many lyric qualities to the language, and we heard some of that when you were reading, and even the moments that maybe, you know, became harder to read aloud, it's because it's so heavy on the linguistic play and the different elements of sound play, repetition, and anaphora that are happening. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about constructing the book in these prose sections, but still relying so heavily on more of like the lyric elements and these kind of poetic, I guess, poetic leanings that we always hear in more kind of lineated work.
Yeah. I mean, I went to graduate school for poetry and I consider myself to be a poet. But I think when I started my sort of writing journey, even as a teenager, I always thought I was going to be a prose writer. And so prose is a form I continue to return to, though it is not a form I feel is my strength. And I think it's because I get freaked out by how many words are involved in writing a novel or some sort of long form piece. But I think there's a part of me that's kind of always has this sort of pull towards prose, and I'm always interested in sort of what happens if we dive into the prose. And so I think that sort of is where Field Study started. It started as an essay, and it started as an essay about interracial desire. And it became clear that in my mind, an essay, even if an essay by definition is an attempt, but even if I didn't come to some sort of answer, I felt like I wasn't going to be able to be successful in that attempt. I didn't feel like I was going to be able to answer any real questions that I was going into the project with. And so I think I pulled back from the essay and leaned a little bit more into what I was comfortable with, which is poetry. And I love the musicality of poetry. I love a sonnet, even though I don't necessarily love sort of end rhyme. I love internal rhyme, and I love music and anaphora and alliteration. And I got tripped up over some of it when I was reading it just now. But I think for me, I was interested in telling some sort of larger narrative for which prose and prose poetry felt like the right move. But I didn't want people to enter the project having any of the expectations that you might have coming into an essay. I wanted, for me, poetry is this space in which you construct a world that you sort of abandon your readers in. You construct an image, you construct a brief narrative, a picture, a moment, and you sort of abandon your readers in that. And I think for me, that's what makes poetry more accessible to me, is because I don't want to be able to come to conclusions. I just want to give you a lot of layers. And I think that's what I was going for in terms of the style that I chose for the book that I still can't fully describe sometimes.
No, that's great. And I think there's something about the way that the form enables the speaker to sort of enact that questioning too. Like the speaker is never fully coming to those conclusions the same way that the reader isn't expected to. And I think that that is a great way that the form is just kind of enabling you to not have to have an answer to impossible questions and impossible things to work through. And there's a lot of great kind of movement and chatter in the chat about, you know, that idea of like moving back and forth between histories and different images and things like that. Also, to everyone, please put questions that you have for Shayla in the chat. I always try to keep an eye on the chat. Gotten, I guess, okay at kind of this virtual multitasking here. So if you have questions, I'll try to loop them in as they come up so that I'm not just going through my quite long list of questions that I have here. And maybe this is kind of related to form, but towards process too. When did you figure out that the essay wasn't going to work? Was it, you know, you were writing and just kept writing, or was it you were writing and then you put it away and then came back and inspiration hit? I'm always curious about kind of at what point in the process does it feel like it's actually becoming what it's supposed to be?
Yeah, I probably started like meditating on this topic in 2016, like early 2016. And it'd been part of my work before, but I think I started thinking about the essay probably in early 2016. And I was working on it in 2016 and 2017, but mostly working on it meant that I was accruing a lot of notes, which is ultimately sort of how the form ended up taking place. I had this Word document where I was like, oh, this quote from something that I read is really useful. Let me just pop it in there. And then I'd follow it up with a couple of sentences that were related or in conversation with what I'd included, like the quote that I'd included. And so I started with sort of those chunks that ended up sort of looking like the final form, but I kept trying to write an essay, or I tried to like construct something, a body around the notes. And it always just felt wrong. It just felt like I was trying to come to conclusions for someone else's sake, as opposed to really sort of doing the investigation that I wanted to do. But I kind of continued for probably about 2 years. And then I kind of shifted the essay. I was thinking about Eula Biss's All Apologies and her essay Time and Distance Overcome from Notes from No Man's Land. And I thought about how they are sort of like these episodic braided essays that have these little chunks. And I was like, okay, so what if I had just little chunks, little meditative chunks, like a lyric essay? So I moved back from the idea of a traditional essay to a lyric essay. And then I started, for some reason, actually, I know why. Diana Coy Wynn, the poet, does beautiful work with her margins. And so I was like, what if I mess with the margins a little bit? And so I started narrowing the columns and narrowing the columns, and then found this physical form and body that felt like, okay, you're going to need to abandon the essay. I don't know what this is or what it looks like, but just kind of lean into this form. And slowly but surely, it started to feel less like an essay and more like a poem. And I think for a while, I was trying to decide, what is it? And I kept writing those poems in the doc, like those questions in the document, and they end up in the book. Like, what is this? Because I was processing as I was going, and suddenly it felt like, okay, this questioning is part of the form. The questioning is part of what the final product will be. And it actually was Diana Coy Wynn who encouraged me to keep going when I was sort of like, I don't know what this is. And she was like, well, does it have to be something? She told me once, we don't have to know all of the parameters. And that gave me a lot of freedom, because I felt like I needed to know what the parameters were in order to keep going. And when I let go of that, I was able to really move forward with the form. But when I say move forward with the form, I think I figured out, I probably had like 30 or 45 pages of notes. And I found the form and I only had 15 pages. And I was like, so this means I'm starting all over again, which was good for the project, but, you know, a little disheartening at the time when I felt like I was hitting the reset button.
Yeah. I love that that idea of like not needing to know the parameters, and also, you know, the freedom that comes with just kind of playing with the margins, playing with the space that's available, like the same way an artist would play with their medium. You know, we have the space of the page, and I think that can be freeing too, and just maybe unlocking something. I'm going to pop into the chat real quick. You mentioned maybe kind of starting this project in 2016, and obviously you were editing and maybe finalizing things last year. And so Dawn is wondering what impact the Black Lives Movement has had on your poetry over this time of writing.
I mean, I think, the project investigates, part of it investigates an interracial relationship. And so I think I was finishing the final draft was supposed to be due March 30th, 2020. And I was supposed to spend my entire spring break polishing and making it make sense. And because I had probably a draft that was maybe 3,000 words longer, and it felt too loose and too messy. And so I was supposed to spend spring break sort of like pulling back a little bit. But then the pandemic happened. And so I asked for more time from my editors, who gave it to me. And then I turned that final draft in probably early May, and they got back to me at the end of May and were like, so this is due June 15th. And then June happened last year, and I was like, so I'm going to need more time again. And I probably didn't turn the book in until about August 1. It was really difficult to write or edit this project or be in this project in that moment. I was grappling with my own things in terms of what was going on in the national conversation. What was going on in the national conversation for me wasn't new, and it wasn't June of last year. It was every day of my life. And I think it was hard to have this inundation of other people coming to a radical realization and wanting to involve me in their radical realization of what was going on in the world. I think it was just really exhausting and a really difficult time. And so also just writing about whiteness, like a relationship to whiteness in that time, was really difficult. But I read a great essay, and I've probably mentioned it in every single book tour conversation I've had now. And you would think I would have looked up the name of the essay by this point, but I did not, you all, I apologize. But it's in the Paris Review, and it's by Margaret Sexton Wilkerson. And it's about her partner and husband is white, and waking up next to him in the midst of June. And sort of her vulnerability in that essay is what honestly just kept me going, that I was not the only person who was sort of wrestling with some of these things in this really trying moment. So yeah, that's probably the best way I can respond.
Yeah. And I think of course, this book is dealing with kind of the fallout of that interracial relationship, but it's also investigating the ways that the speaker is in relation to members of the Black community as well. There's this kind of ebb and flow, and how the speaker is kind of navigating both of those differences. And I think that it comes out just so beautifully in different passages. I keep thinking of the section where the speaker is saying, a white person came up to me and said, "Oh, I read Citizen, I get it." And I think that, like so much of that burden that's being placed on the speaker in that instance is just really coming through in the ebb and flows of the prose pieces here. Oh, Anita has put the link to that essay in the chat. Thank you, Anita.
Yes, I saw Anita and Tyler.
And Tyler, yes. Thank you for sourcing that for us. That's one of the benefits of the virtual space. And Alexandra is asking about the ending to the book. And I'm kind of curious as well, not just specifically the ending, but I think the question there is about the final lines. "I hope you never read this. I hope you do." And just kind of what's happening in that moment. But and maybe if you wanted to broaden that, just talking about how you went about sequencing things with so many parts, and moving from having pages upon pages of notes to organizing them into the collection too.
So I actually wrote the very beginning and the very end of the book first, and some random chunk that's probably like 2/3 of the way through. When I sold this book to FSG, I had when I first showed it to them, I had all of 15 pages, and they were like, "This seems great, let's see more." And I said, this is super exciting. I actually don't have any more, but I'm happy to make more happen. And so they first reached out to me about potentially publishing my first book, Mistress, but it was right after I'd signed a contract for it. And so I said, I got brave and said, I might have something else, knowing good and darn well I barely had something else. So be brave, everybody. But so that was probably in like July of 2018. And I think it was like June of 2019 when I finally sort of wrote this first chunk that sold the book. But I wrote the very beginning and the very end because I knew sort of where the arc was going. I was sitting somewhere watching the sun go down and I was like, oh, this is an act of cannibalization. The final line talks about, I hope you never read this. I hope you do. I'm forgiving me, I've cannibalized you. And I sort of knew that's sort of the ending I was moving towards based on a quote from Shara McCallum, who told me once, do not write about something you're not willing to cannibalize. Mm-hmm. And so I was really interested in like what it meant to cannibalize something. And so I wrote the arc and then wrote into the middle. And that's what I told people at FSG is that I wanted to write into the middle. I didn't know how I was going to arrive at that ending, but I felt pretty confident that's what I was doing, a process of note-taking and cannibalization. And so it really meant that I printed out a lot of different iterations of the draft of the book. And so I would print out, 30, if I had 30 pages, and then I would print out my notes page. And the notes page came from my journal and it came from notes on my phone. And I literally sort of like wrote into like, okay, this quote should go on page 25 between these two sections. And I numbered every single one of the sections. Every time that I printed out. So at some point I had this 140-page document with like 400 some odd individual sections. And I was moving them that way. Like, okay, I'm on page 75 and at note 120, I think note 120 should move to page 5 after note 15. And so it was this really tactile process. You can't really see it, but it's in the background right there. I have another collection of poems sort of collection of poems taped to my wall. For me, writing is a physical thing. Yes, it has a lot to do with like deleting and adding things on a computer, but I actually write a lot of first drafts by hand. A lot of this book was taken down in a notebook or on my phone and then typed up, printed, and then edited by hand. For me, that's how my brain works. And unfortunately, it didn't feel like I could print out 400 or 500 individual sections and move them around like that. That felt a little crazy making for me. So I had to find like a new process for this particular project, which I found difficult at times, but I think ended up working out. But yeah, it was like a really physical sort of manipulation of the language to move it from this place to that. But the note taking and allowing myself to be flexible with how it appeared in the book. So as I was reading a different book and saying, oh my gosh, that would be a great quote, popping it into where I thought it would be, but that's not necessarily where it lives in the final draft, which means I have a really hard time finding anything in this book at this point because things have moved so many times that I still kind of have to look up from time to time. Okay, where is that now? So hopefully with time, I'll get a little bit better.
No, I love hearing about writer's process. And I'm similar. I always print mine out. I draft by hand, then I type it and kind of tinker a lot, and then I print it. And when I was working on my thesis this past year, this wall behind me, I was like hanging all my poems up. And so, yeah, I definitely feel that need to just be able to kind of visualize and kind of externalize that work in that way. I've also done the kind of like cutting apart things, but I feel like you would be having a lot of strips of paper to deal with.
I really thought about it though. I was like, do I cut it all up? But I was freelancing a lot at the beginning of like writing this book, I was still freelancing quite a bit. And so I was like, I was moving a lot. And so I was like, I don't actually have the physical space to like put something up and then pull down 400 sheets of paper, like tiny sheets of paper. That also just doesn't seem eco-friendly. But yeah, I think it's really good to like make your work physical in that way. I think for me, it makes it feel more real. It lives not just in my mind and not just on these handwritten pages, but I can see it living in the world a little bit more when I print it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it forces that distance in a way. You can't just shut the laptop. It's like they're out here and we're going to see them. Yeah. I'm going to pop into the chat because we have a lot of questions that are wonderful. So I'll go to Dawn's first. I'll kind of go from top down. what motivates you to write poetry? Is the goal to express yourself, make an impact? And any reviews or comments that you've received, perhaps that have been meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think for me, my big thing is I went to books to feel seen. I didn't always feel seen in my communities. And so I went to books not just as a different space from my own world, but as a way of feeling seen and feeling less alone. And so for me, the big reason that I write is, yes, I'm obviously processing some things in my work sometimes, and sometimes there are tidbits of my own life in it. But I think primarily what I'm doing is an act of vulnerability, not just for the sake of processing or not just for the sake of vulnerability, which aren't bad reasons to do it, but the hope that I create more space for other people to be that vulnerable, and to allow themselves to be the fullest versions of themselves that are possible, which might include messiness, which might include contradiction. And so for me, some of the greatest reviews or feedback I've received is people saying like, oh, I saw myself in this project, or like, I didn't know that someone else felt this way. And that's really my ultimate goal, is that like creating space where other people feel seen and feel less alone, and hopefully are encouraged to be either brave in their work or brave in their life in some way.
Great. Yeah, you mentioned, not feeling the need to hide kind of the messiness. And I think something that I love about the speaker across this book is those moments of kind of vulnerability and admission, like, oh, I'm not the good guy right now, and it's not to say that the speaker was bad in those instances. It's just human. And I think a lot of times you don't see that in narratives on television or things like that, that are more popular. And so that was definitely something that I responded to. That need not to be perfect,
Yeah,
on the page, I think was wonderful.
thank you.
Yvette is wondering, what writers influence you and who are you reading right now? The end line sounds vaguely reminiscent of Ishmael Reed's "Beware, do not read this poem."
Mm. Who am I reading right now? That's always a question that I feel like I should always be prepared to answer, but never am. But I'm currently rereading Dantiel W. Monize's Milk Blood Heat. She's part of my writing community, and I started rereading her book when I did my first event with City Lights a week ago. And I just wanted to sort of reread the work to be sort of in her brain before the event. And so I'm still rereading it. I'm also reading Danielle Evans' The Office of Historical Corrections. I'm not apparently reading any poetry, which isn't true. Those are just the first two that came to mind. I'm reading Felicia Zamora's I Always Carry My Bones. It's a poetry collection that came out in April. And I'm hoping to read next Arrow by Sumita Chakraborty. So yeah, those are probably like I'm also reading The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, if I'm being honest. Sometimes you need to escape this world, and I was rereading it, and I read it as a teenager, and so that's I kind of, if you couldn't tell from field study, I'm often reading many things at once, or just like allowing lots of different things to come into my brain, and so I'm often reading a couple of books at once. In terms of writers that inspire me, my community, I've got a really great community of writers for which I'm super grateful. And I feel often very, very inspired by them. So I've mentioned a number of them already. Diana Quay Wynn, Dantiel W. Monize, those are the two people that and Maria Alvarez are the three people that I probably write with the most regularly, two prose writers and one poet, in different fashions that we sort of push each other and our work. But in terms of sort of like literary giants, I always go back to Audre Lorde. Particularly her essays, which you can, again, probably see from the book. I return to Natasha Trethewey for form often. Yeah, those are probably like, in terms of form and in terms of conversations about Black womanhood, I would say Natasha Trethewey and Audre Lorde in that order.
Wonderful. Yeah, I hope everyone is taking notes because these are great writers to turn to. And I always feel like the second someone asks what you're reading, it's like every book you've ever read disappears out of
And did you see me?
head.
I was like, can I see any of the books out of the corners of my eyes?
I'm the same way. But I also I think there's such value in maybe dabbling in a few different books at the same time, which kind of leads into Tyler's question about bringing in these other voices within the collection. And this aligned with one of my points of inquiry as well. You know, these other voices come in, and they're not just like quotes that you read and you move on. They're really part of the dialogue with the speaker, and I think that the way that they kind of build into the book without feeling like, oh, I'm just kind of citing someone. You know, it's really organic and it moves. And Tyler says, you know, it's at sometimes it reads as a love letter to those other voices. So can you just talk about your use of those voices, from Audre Lorde, who you mentioned, and Ada Limon and Annalise Keating? I mean, there's so many different points of reference in field study.
Yeah, I think because it started as an essay and because I started with like quotes and notes, it felt very organic to me in the beginning to include some of them. And it just felt like the universe was throwing me all of these things. Like the voices were part of it. And at some point I realized like, oh, that's part of the field. That's part of the study that's happening. If I'm doing observational research, of course, all of these things that would be sort of flooding my present would become part of the project. And so I just sort of gave into that. And oftentimes, like someone asked, did you go hunting for the quotes, or did the quotes come to you? Were you writing a response to the quotes? Did you pop them in? And all of those things are true. I did all of those things. Sometimes I was like, oh my gosh, this quote would be great here. And sometimes I started with the quote and built out from that. And there's many quotes that, you know, inspired this collection that initially were in it that aren't in it anymore. But I think for me, it was the accumulation of things that make a life. So all of the notes in the book are this accumulation of how this writer or how the speaker ended up in this particular relationship and how she found herself moving forward. And so that includes pop culture. It includes, you know, these Black thinkers. It includes quotes from other sources like TV shows, because Annalise Keating is the main character on How to Get Away with Murder. Olivia Pope gets a voice, but also people that get voices are people that my copy editors asked, who is this? I'm getting, for instance, Naila Cummings, who's my best friend. They're like, I'm getting someone who works at a research hospital in New York City. I'm like, yes, that's her. And so I also loved the idea of making all of these voices carry equal weight in the speaker's world. Like Heraclitus and Disney's Pocahontas from the section I just read, like both have that meaningful impact for her in terms of where she collected this language. And so, yeah, I think it is a love letter to sort of all of these different people and voices, because I think that's part of what makes the speaker who she is in this project, all of these different voices. And so even though I'm telling a singular person's story doesn't happen in a void. We're all impacted by the world that surrounds us as we come to be the person that we are. And so I wanted to include some of that world in the book.
Yeah, I love the way that the intertextual elements, just like you said, there's no privileging, you know, Audre Lorde over Bruce Banner. You know, like all of these elements are coming in, and they have the same level of meaning for the speaker and therefore the reader as well, who's kind of entering in this world too. And I was thinking a lot about this idea of collecting. And in the beginning, the speaker's presenting field research and says field research is the collection of observational information, which is basically kind of what we get here with a lot more added. But you know, we also call poetry books collections too. So as writers, as poets, we're collecting things as well, and we're always bringing in the writers that we're reading and the writers that we're citing and everything that we're taking in. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about this idea of collecting and, you know, how it works, maybe both literally and metaphorically, and how it kind of allowed you to work through the subject matter in the book.
Yeah, I think collecting is such a big part of who I understand myself to be as a writer. It kind of goes back to what I was just saying about like none of this happens within a vacuum. I think I'm always really interested in the surrounding landscape. My first book deals a lot with history. And so I've always been interested in like, how is the present affected by the past? And how did we arrive where we are? And so for me, collecting is this like larger sort of obsession in my work. How do I bring all of these things together? How are they all in conversation? How do I understand this world and this universe with all of this material I've been given? And in some ways, I feel like collecting is maybe the biggest through line of my work so far, and maybe will continue to be. Like, I'm working on 2 new projects, and both of them I can see how they both distinctly different and nothing like Mistress or Field Study, but I can definitely see all of the threads that led me from those first 2 projects to these second 2 projects. And so I think there's something to, I always think of building a body and like how we are a collection of organs, how we are a collection of air. And so I think about like a body of work in that way, that we are a collection of a lot of different things that we gather and the influences that impact us. And so, yeah, I think that's coming through in not just the notes in Field Study, but in the research that happens in Mistress and in these other projects, in the way that I am collecting the ideas about origins of language or collecting narratives and stories about travel. Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially reading Mistress while I was waiting for my copy of Field Study and then going right to Field Study, I definitely see some of those threads, and even the idea of, you know, the voice and kind of community within the book. You know, in Mistress, Sally Hemings has a voice just as the speaker has a voice, and they're in conversation the same way that the speaker is in conversation with so many people and sources in Field Study.
Yeah.
And I think community is something, maybe another one of those through lines in at least these 2 works, and maybe it'll kind of blur into the next few. But could you just talk a little bit about how community fits into your writing practice? You know, you've mentioned your writing group and the people that you lean on, but you've also been to different residencies like Hedgebrook and MacDowell and things like that. So I just wonder how that fits in with all of the other other things that you're juggling, and how you make space for yourself to write this work.
Yeah, I mean, community, I don't think I realized how fundamental it was into my writing process until the pandemic. And in retrospect, I'm not sure how I didn't recognize it before. The bulk of Field Study was written in 15-day bursts. So not one singular 15-day burst, but you know, Tupelo Press does this 30-30 project, and my friend Diana Coy-Wynn did it once, and she said, wow, this is really difficult. I'm much better at 15-15s. So since probably 2016 or 2017, twice a year, we do 15-15, so 15 poems in 15 days. And she writes gorgeous, stunning poems at the end of every single one of those 15 days. I write things, and they're not gorgeous or stunning or fully formed, but it's this accountability that I have with her that's like, at the end of every one of these 15 days, we're going to produce something. And even if it's not, for me, polished, I try and put my best foot forward, because I know that she's putting her best foot forward as well. And so it's having that another person to say like, I'm doing it, are you doing it here with me, has been really wonderful. And so I wrote the bulk of the book, or at least huge chunks of the book, in these 15-15 bursts. And for me, residencies have been really important, not only as a way of building community, but as a way of hitting pause on my life. Even if I take time off from work and I'm at home, I'm like, okay, so there's laundry I need to do. Okay, so there's groceries that I need to purchase. I should have cleaned this 3 weeks ago, so I should do it now because I have the time. And so residencies have been really important because they allow me to hit pause on my everyday life and focus on the writing, but also focus on building community. Dantiel W. Moniz I met at Hedgebrook, and a really great intentional space. And her and I have continued a really great friendship. And we write with Maria Alvarez once a week. So at 8:30 tonight, if they email me back, we will be writing. But we started this in the pandemic because we couldn't go to the AWP conference together. And we're mourning the fact that we weren't going to be able to see each other, because I live in Pennsylvania and Dantiel is in Florida. And at the time, Maria was in Madrid. And so we started this sort of once a week time commitment, and it's only an hour and a half or 2 hours, but we set a 25-minute timer and we go for 3 Pomodoros. So we do 3 25-minute chunks of writing, and sometimes we'll continue and sometimes we won't. And sometimes that writing time looks like being like filling out writing applications or cleaning out our inboxes. So it's not always pure writing, but knowing again that there are other people alongside me trying to do the work is really important. And we're planning on kind of creating our own residency for just the three of us to go somewhere and write. And so I say that to say, like, if you have other writer humans in your life, you can create an intentional residency and create an intentional space. And those can be really rewarding as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think that sense of accountability is so important because writing can feel so solitary at times, like you're just kind of plugging away at your work in your own little bubble, and having at least just one person who you know is also plugging away at their work is definitely something that keeps you going. I know I was trying to do the 1,000 words of summer, which is popular on Twitter, which 1,000 words is quite a lot for a poet. So
I was gonna say, I was like, did you push it down to like 100 words?
Yeah. I definitely was like, unless I really am trying to write essays right now. But I mean, there's just something about having just that little burst and like that 2 week span. I know for a fact I don't write every day. That's just not part of my practice.
Yeah.
And so I think that finding what works, and obviously what you've done works because we are holding the book here. So
I think it also like bursts work if you have a really busy day-to-day life. Like I was saying before, I was freelancing for a while. And so like I was working 60-hour weeks at sometimes, and I just didn't have the time to sit down and be like, I'm gonna write a poem a day, or even how I was gonna carve it out in my week. But even when I take like 5 days away and commit that time to writing, it makes a world of difference because it's like a pressure cooker. I've been saving all the language for that moment. I know it's coming. I can also focus on it because I'm not trying to juggle all these other things.
yeah, that's a good point too. And, even in that writing space, the other things that are still part of the process, like the applications or the
Yes.
research, I've learned to be more gentle with myself with things like, okay, reading this other book is part of my writing process, or watching this TV show is part of my writing
Yes.
process,
Yes.
because, there's those conversations between things. So, yeah, there's definitely ways to keep going.
If I hadn't rewatched Mad Men, who knows if I would have written this book. So there you go.
See, it's the things that we don't know that will kickstart the project, and
Yep.
then it comes out in these craft chats. So Natalia is wondering, in your opinion, what sets poetry apart as a unique art form, and why did you feel that writing poetry was the best way to tell this story?
What sets poetry apart as a unique art form? I think for me, part of it is just like this fundamental beauty of the language. Like there's so few words in what we're doing that every word should count, or it usually counts. And so I feel like, not to say that prose writers aren't putting lots of pressure on their language, but boy, if you're spending as much time wondering like over these two words or a semicolon or an em dash as poets are, then it must take you literally forever to write anything. So I think there's just like this, we're so attuned to, again, not to discredit prose, but so attuned to the structure of the line, the sound, the cadence, that I feel like we can only give that much energy to it because there's so few words. And there's something to me that's really beautiful about just that attention. We have in our worlds today, there's so many things pulling on our attention. All of us are typically multitasking. Some of you might be cooking dinner during this graph chat. Like we're always doing and I'm not offended, cook your dinner. But all of us are doing a million things at once. And so poetry is this incredible slowdown for me, where even when I'm writing it, it requires me to be it requires me to be still in a way that even I talk quickly, and I recognize this. And I think poetry just sort of slows me down and makes me pay attention in ways that I don't give space to in the rest of my life. So I think that's part of the beauty of poetry for me. As for why I felt like poetry was the right fit for this book, I think poetry allows a lot of space for meditation. At some point in the book, I ask, what is truth in poetry? What exists in the gaps? And I think so much exists in the silence and the gaps of poetry, and in that stillness. It allows a lot of space for us as the readers to step into it, and either place ourselves in it or to meditate on that experience. And so I felt like I said before, I didn't feel like I was going to come to any sort of conclusions or answers, and that would have felt like artifice if I would have. And so the space that poetry offers allowed me the space to resist any sort of explanations and just to allow for the expansion that white space and language can offer when I just sort of like, here's an image and I'll let you sit with it and then I'll move on to someone else does.
Yeah, there is definitely that amount of kind of agonizing over the one word or the one line break. And again, not to say that prose writers don't do this, but I feel like anytime I read a book of prose that's written by someone who was formerly a poet, I can immediately tell, because I know there's just a different kind of level of linguistic attention to some of the lines there, or
Like
sentences.
Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, if you haven't read it, highly recommend it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and that's quoted in the book too, which that
Yeah.
book was really recent. So that really kind of puts in perspective how you were working, constantly on bringing in these pieces of information to the
Mhm.
text. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your publishing journey, between Mistress and Field Study. You mentioned that you had just signed a contract for Mistress, and then FSG came in. So I wonder if you could just talk about that kind of draft to manuscript to submission and then publication process for you.
Yeah, so I wrote the first poem that was related to the Sally Hemings project and Mistress in 2011. It's not a poem that lives in the book, but like just to give you an idea, that I wrote my first poem that was towards the project in 2011, and the book got published in 2019. I wrote the book from 2011 to 2017, and while I was at Hedgebrook in August of 2017, I was like, oh, I think I finally finished the book. And I'd submitted it a couple of times to contests, poetry first book contests before then, but I knew it wasn't done. And so I felt far more confident sending it to contests once I knew it was done. And I feel really lucky that so I submitted it sort of haphazardly for 1 year. And then when the book was done from 2017 to 2018, I sent it far more intentionally. So I read in those years a lot of first books that were selected to win contests and decided where it felt like my work was probably most likely aligned.
Mhm.
So I had like this curated list of first book prizes that I really liked the books that they put out over the last couple of years that I applied to. And so I had like my first round of people, and then I had my second round, and I was like, I'll continue to kind of like go towards these rounds. And I was really lucky that in the first round, New Issues picked up Field Study. But in one of the things that I was doing, I read that FSG accepted unsolicited submissions. You could send 3 poems and a 1-page cover letter.
Mm.
And so I did. And I sent it in maybe like March of 2018. And I heard back about Mistress from New Issues in June of 2018. Signed the contract early July, and by mid-July, FSG reached out and was like, we'd love to see the full manuscript. And I was like, oh, I didn't actually think you read the slush pile. This is news to me. Thank you so much. My book is taken. And like I said before, I got brave and said, but I have other work if you're interested in seeing it. And the person I was in conversation with said, yeah, I'd love to see more work. And so I sent him again another 3 pages and a 1-page cover letter. And it was the very beginning of Field Study. And so he said, I'd like to see more. And so I sent him 15 pages in October, and didn't hear from him. I told myself, if you don't hear from him in 3 months, you'll just send him an email back that says, I'm assuming the answer is no, but I just wanted to touch base. And I didn't hear from him for 3 months. And so I took an extra month because I was nervous and emailed him and said, I'm assuming that you all have decided to pass, but I just want to just double check. And he said, oh my gosh, it got lost in my email. Could you send it again? So I did. And I mean, again, this is a conversation about being brave and taking those steps that are sometimes scary. Like I could have said, no, the book is taken. Thank you so much for considering it. And that could have been the end, or I could have let that email sort of linger in the ether and never followed up and let that have been the end. But I sent it to him again. And within 2 weeks, he said, oh, I would like to talk to you about this project. And that led to a couple months of back and forth where they said, you know, this is a form that it seems like you're also, like it's a new form for us, but you also seem like you're unfamiliar with this form. And I think we all both needed to sort of be convinced that I could do it. And so I probably sent that time in October, 3,000 words. And he was like, go away and write some more and see what happens. And if it works, then I think we'd be interested in publishing it. And so I took another 3 or 4 months. I did one of those self-guided writing retreats. I went to Whidbey Island with Don Teal for 2 weeks and worked on the project. And that's where I came up with the final line for the book and sent it. And in a couple of weeks, I heard back and they said, okay, I think we want to move forward with this. And that sort of started this back and forth about how does that work. In the midst of all of this, at some point, I did get an agent just because it was different working with a small, New Issues comes out of Western Michigan University. So it's a university press. It was very different working with a university press where my contract was 2 pages and a New York City publisher where my contract was like 35 pages and had language I fully did not understand. And so, yeah, it was just like a really big, quick pivot. And so I think people are like, oh my gosh, you wrote 2 books really quickly. And I say, no, I wrote 1 book in 8 years and then the other one in 4. So I'm moving faster, but not moving as quickly as it might appear, because I had a lot of the notes for field study, even though it wasn't sort of fully constructed or concocted. And so I spent the next, I guess, year and some change working on it up until, July of last year. I was still adding in quotes, taking in quotes, reorganizing things. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Don't self-reject, right? Don't give up on your work before it's even had a chance to be looked at. And I think too that publishing can have this sort of masquerade of how fast a writer produces work, because when you do look at, I was like, oh, 2019, like that is fast for a poet. But then obviously the manuscript has to evolve and develop, and then it has to be on submission for cycles. And there's so much that goes into the back end, and just also not giving up on your work is so important when you've spent so much time and that it's worth fighting for. So we're wrapping up with just about 5 minutes left, and Don has a question in the chat, which is an interesting question, and I don't think it's talked about that much in our craft chats. But how important is it for you, if at all, to earn money from your poetry? And of course, fiction and generates more income. I think a lot of people think that poets jump to fiction because there's a little more money there. But it's interesting.
I never thought I was going to make a single penny on poems. So I've never been invested in it being sort of like the moneymaker for me. I think it would be unwise to invest in that being my moneymaker. I think for me, it matters, like this matters more to me. Yes, I want people to I want to sell books, but I really want people to read more than anything. And I want people to be in conversation. So if you're reading Field Study, if everyone's reading the same copy of Field Study from the same library, yes, it means that it might make it harder for publishers to think that I am financially viable to take on. But I'm more interested in sort of what people get out of it and the conversations that are happening surrounding it, and the ways in which I get to engage with people. It's why I teach. I love to teach. I don't teach because it feels like the thing that writers do. I was a kid who I'm going to share like a kind of embarrassing story. Like I would set up my stuffed animals and I would teach, and I would use my other like classmates' names from school. And like I was doing that at like 4 or 5, and I would get extra workbooks that my mom would give me. And I'd be like, oh, I've got grading to do, Mom, as like a 5-year-old. And so it's always been something that I've been super interested in. And so I love the conversations that happen in classrooms. Like I have a couple people here that are in my workshop for Writer House in Virginia right now. And like I just love being in conversation with people. I love talking about craft. I love talking about the work, about how we can make each other grow as writers. Because it's not just me being someone who's like, I know things that I'm going to share with you. Like I learned so much from teaching. I'm so inspired by teaching. I often like tear up at the end of a semester or the end of a workshop because I'm like, am I going to get to engage with these people again? And so for me, it's less important if I'm making money off of poems. I will find other ways to make money. I've edited textbooks. I've slung wine at a winery. I've done all sorts of random things. I worked as a grants manager. I was at an art museum. I've nannied. I did all of these things to make money so that I could be invested in the art. Because that's really important to me, to be invested in the art, and I'll make money other ways. And so again, there's a lot more money in fiction and nonfiction. But I think for me, and it's not to say I won't write those things, but I don't think I'm ever chasing them for the money. I'm chasing them for the opportunity to be in rooms like this with you all.
Yeah, it comes down to that idea of conversation. You know, there's a conversation between the book and the reader, the teacher in the classroom, the students and the teacher. And I think all of those things are what come together to build a great learning environment. And I think that conversation is obviously very present in field study as well. Um, Perhaps for a last question, do you have any craft books or craft advice that you find yourself turning to when you write or when you teach?
So my go-to, I've actually been looking for more craft books that are written by more a diverse breadth of people. So if you have any, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I would love to know. But I often go to some of my mentors and some of the people who have just been really amazing throughout my writing process, like Shara McCallum is someone I continue to turn to for her craft advice. She appears in the book. Don't write about something you're not ready to cannibalize is something that's been really important and guiding in my creative life. But the things I often tell my students is don't write unless you have to. And it's mostly for undergraduates who are asking me, should I go to graduate school? I'm like, don't write unless you have to, because for those of us who have to write, you're going to know, because you're not going to feel like yourself if you're not writing. And writing takes grit. There's going to be tons of rejection and tons of letdowns. For instance, MacDowell rejections went out today. And so people were feeling their feelings about MacDowell rejections today. And so like, I was one of the rejected at MacDowell this time. And so like, don't write unless you have to, because it takes grit and it takes patience. And I often remind people of something that you were saying earlier, Emily, about counting a lot of different things as writing. Like writing is not just the words that you put on the page. It's the research you're doing. Sometimes it's the films you're watching. Sometimes it's the dinners you have with friends that maybe end up quoted in the book. A lot of things count as writing. And so don't feel like you're not writing because you're in a space where you're thinking and meditating and focus on staying alive or like contributing to other parts of your life. It doesn't mean that you're not a writer. It just means that you're collecting all the things that will eventually pour out onto the page. So I think, definitely giving yourself grace when it comes to your writing journey and your writing life, and being expansive and saying like, oh my gosh, I sat in the sun and read a book and drank some wine and I should have been writing. And my response is you were writing. And so just being generous with yourself.
That's great. That's such a great place to end, though. I hate ending these chats because I feel like we could just spend hours talking. But thank you so much for all of your openness and vulnerability. And thank you to our audience for questions. Please, everyone, before you leave, buy Field Study. While you're in the bookshop link, pick up a copy of Mistress for a nice kind of double feature here. Thank you, Shayla, for spending this time with us. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you everyone at Writer House. I'm sorry, the Writer Center. Writer's House is where I'm teaching. Sorry.